let me address trans stuff because we're going to run out of time, and this is one of those fields in which we disagree, but I hope that we can figure out why we disagree in an amiable way. What's your position on trans?
So my position on trans people is that they suffer from a mental disorder, and that just because you declare you are a member of the opposite sex does not make you a member of the opposite sex, and that there are distinctions between men and women. And the idea that you can just become a member of the opposite sex, or that society should treat you as a member of the opposite sex because you declare it so, is bad for society. It's bad for individuals, and it undermines basic distinctions that are necessary, particularly for inculcation in children who tend to be sexually confused anyway.
Let me start by agreeing with you on a few points, which is the last one. I think if there are, as someone who's married to a guy myself, I have a lot of dealings with people who were confused about their own sexuality and their gender identity when they were in their teens. And I know I have gay friends who say that if the climate when they were 13 had been the same as it is now with regards to trans issues, it's entirely possible that they would have concluded that they were trans. So, it is a difficult time when you're young. You have lots of emotions and lots of attractions and lots of confusing different identities. And so honoring that turmoil and not expecting that every 5-year-old or 8-year-old or even 12-year-old knows exactly, has great perspicacity and wisdom about their own fixed identity forever, I think is wise, just as a precautionary principle. And I also think that the question of who should pay for transitions is an interesting one, whether or not the Pentagon, for example, should be paying for trans servicemen and women to have gender reassignment surgery. I think that, and the question of age, and also then the question of whether or not authorities, whether or not government institutions, and this comes back to our kind of joint libertarianism, whether government institutions should have a right to instruct parents on how they ought to be treating their children, that is hugely problematic. But there are several strands of science going on here, and I've heard you in the past say that this is just sort of science, that men are men and women are women. I mean, I think that's sort of begging the question in terms of in the strict philosophical fallacy sense, which is that you're right that men are men and women are women if men are XX and women are XY and intersex are something different. But to say trans women aren't real women because women have two X chromosomes, the whole point under debate is whether or not possessing two X chromosomes is both necessary and sufficient to give you the female gender as well as just the female sex.
Right. So what I would suggest is that we look at it in the other way. What can we tell is not a woman? Okay, we know that you're not a woman, but not just because you don't say that you're a woman, but because you're not a woman. Right, so you'd actually have to show me some physical indicators that you were a woman. Okay, brain structures would be fine if you wanted to show me that there was such a thing as a female brain, which has been denied by feminists for decades now. But if you wanted to show that there is a female brain and that this is the way that we are going to now define gender, is we're going to say that the brain is what defines sex, right? It's not chromosomal anymore. But that's not the argument the trans community is making. The trans community is making the argument that if I, who have no physical malady, no physical, my chromosomes are all the same as they were 5 years ago. If I say one day that I am now a woman, you must respect me as a woman. The trans community is actually trying to conflate two arguments, and it's intellectually dishonest. They're trying to say that there's a physical basis for trans. Okay, number one, you have to show me the physical basis for trans. And then I'm happy to discuss whether that's intersex or whether this makes you a member of the opposite sex, because intersex is a category. Right. It seems to me easier that if you say that if you were to say that you have a female brain in a male body, it makes more sense for me to say that you're intersex than it makes sense for me to say that you're a woman. But because the fact is that if you were a woman who, if you were a man and you had a terrible accident, your genitals were cut off, it wouldn't make you a woman, right? It would make you a man with some sort of mutilation. The confusion of terms. The confusion of terms is what I'm aiming at and pointing out and suggesting is actually dishonest, because the argument is not that they have to demonstrate, that anyone has to demonstrate any sort of physical difference from what they were 1 minute ago when they were male in order for them to be trans. You can just say that you're a member of the opposite sex, and now we're all supposed to accept that you're a member of the opposite sex. This is absolute deconstructivist nonsense.
So, one very small point on which I'll agree with you there is that feminism and transgenderism contradict each other.
That's right.
Right. That the left is tying itself up in pretzels here, because people who want to be allies of broadly the gender studies departments can't figure out what to do with the claim that that women and men are basically the same on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's possible for a man to actually be a woman and a woman to actually be a man. But I don't agree that people need to show you some physical evidence in order to be trans. I mean, if there is a phenomenon, if there is a psychological phenomenon in which people are persistently and consistently over time expressing an affiliation with the other gender, not the other sex. I mean, I think you would agree, right, that there are some men who are highly effeminate and other women who have masculine traits.
Of course.
And that therefore gender and sex are not exactly the same thing. And we all know chicks who are more masculine than some really queenie, campy dudes.
Well, I mean, that's true, but I'm not sure. I think that gender is sort of a made up word. I think that it would be more specific if you would just say that you're a male who has effeminate traits. That's a lot more specific than saying you're a male with female gender. I mean, that seems rather stereotypical to me, actually, as far as what male and...
Well, I mean, I don't think that, the thing is, I think you're making a sort of category error by discussing all this as if it's a biological question.
Well, because sex and gender, the way that the left puts it, I think that the category error is the other way. I think the category error is that people suggest that my gender is female, therefore my sex is female, and I ought to be treated as though my sex is female. Your sex is not female, and for you to say that your self-identified gender is your sex is nonsense.
But they don't say their physical sex is female.
No, they do. They say, I am a woman. I mean, I am a woman. And when people talk about sex, they are generally talking about sex. They're not talking about gender. No one cares how you identify. If you want to identify as a woman, I'm not saying that anybody should say that you, I'm not even saying that you can't identify how you want to identify. Do what you want. I'm saying that I am not going to identify you as a woman because you are not a woman. You are not a physical woman, okay? And even if you get a bunch of surgeries, you're still not a physical.
But they know
woman.
that they're not a. But they know that they're not a physical.
No, but the insistence.
No,
but the insistence is. I mean, that's not true. The insistence is by people like Riley Dennis that if I don't want to have sex with a transgender woman, that's because I am a sexist.
Yeah. So let's concede that that's stupid.
Okay,
let's concede that there's craziness. Let's concede that there is craziness and irrationality. But all you're doing when you're taking down that craziness and irrationality,
you are not
small leafs.
I mean, again, I don't understand the objection to even just saying that transgender people are intersex. Why is it that we have to proclaim that they are women? I mean, you don't talk about a category error. That seems to me the easiest one. Why not just proclaim that people are intersex when they're clearly intersex?
Well, we do. Right. I mean, but we're not talking about intersex people. We're talking about transgender people. We're talking about people who.
So the idea is so now the idea is that, again, without any sort of even brain scan to determine whether you have intersex characteristics or transgender characteristics, if Caitlyn Jenner if I today say I am a woman, it is now your moral obligation to call me a woman. This is nonsense.
I mean, I feel like a lot of the objections to this are coming from a place that assumes that this is being done frivolously, right?
No, it's not being done frivolously.
You just declare that you're...
Not at all.
I would agree with you that if there was a phenomenon in which there were lots of people like you and me who just wake up one morning and say, I'm a woman, pranks on you, and then the next day they're like, I'm a fish, and then the following day they're like, I'm a duck,
but the principle is the same. The question is, you understand where we're drawing the outer line. Like, where are you drawing the outer line? I'm using the outer line. I'm saying this is the outer line, and this outer line makes no sense. If you want to talk about,
let's draw the outer line and say that a person is only transgender if for more than 24 months on a weekly basis they assert to being the opposite sex.
Okay, that's fine. Then they suffer. Then they are transgender, and they suffer from a mental disorder in which their sex is different from their perceived gender. Sure, I mean the DSM-4
acknowledges. What is gained by that statement?
What is gained by that statement is that the proposed solution by society is that we completely redefine what sex and gender are in order to make life easier for people who suffer from this mental disorder, whereas the treatment for every other mental disorder is determining what is in accordance with the physical reality as opposed to forcing the entire society to change. We don't do this with anyone else who has body dysmorphia.
But there often isn't.
We don't do this with any other form of body dysmorphia.
It's necessary to call it a physical disorder, Ben. Like, in the fields of psychiatry and psychology and sociology and anthropology, this is a phenomenon, right? This is something that people exhibit over time.
And people exhibit people exhibit body dysmorphia also. Is your suggestion that when somebody says, I'm a one-armed person, but I have two arms, that we should cut off their arm? Or that we should all acknowledge that they're a one-armed person? Or that when someone is anorexic or bulimic and says, I perceive that I am a fat person when I'm actually skinny, that it is our job as society to say to them, in order to make your life easier, we will perceive with you that you are actually a fat person even when you are skinny? Or do we say to them, there's something wrong here, and we as a society can't destroy any distinction based on fat and skinny because it would make you more comfortable.
Let me be generous towards your point of view in a way that I think I'm hopefully being generous about healthcare when I talk about it not being a right, which is to say, let's concede that it's a mental illness. I don't know what that gains us, but if there were a psychological illness that had no medical cure, but had a perfectly effective cultural cure, then I don't see why one wouldn't just support the cultural cure.
Because the question
is, if an OCD patient has to lock the door 12 times in order to be happy, just let him lock the damn door 12 times.
Well, and as I say, I have no problem with you because that imposes nothing on me. But if he has to lock my front door 12 times, then I do have a problem. So my problem has never been, if you want to get a transgender surgery on your own dime, go for it. If you want to call yourself Caitlin, go for it. I don't care. But if your imposition on me is that it is now my job to change my definition of sex and gender based on what you want, that is an imposition on me. It's an imposition on society. And if you're talking about confusing children, start telling 5-year-olds that a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy.
I mean, the question now is whether or not so I take your concern that maybe this indoctrination, as you see it, could lead people who aren't trans to dabble in being trans. But that presupposes what I just said, that there is such a thing as trans. I mean, if you don't believe that trans is even a thing, it's just a sort of mental illness.
Well, no, it presupposes that people will become confused about their sex. I mean, again, the problem I have with this whole discussion is we really have to be very exact about terms. I think even you and I who are trying to be exact are not being exact. But when we say trans, are we talking about the mental disorder of trans? Are we talking about people who identify without actually exhibiting long-term behavior of the mental disorder? Are we talking about brain scans that show that there's a mental disorder? Because, you do have brain scans of other mental disorders that actually show up on a brain scan. There's a lot of vagary in this terminology, and I feel as though the vagary in the terminology is being used as a cudgel in order to suggest that you're intolerant if you don't believe that Caitlyn Jenner is actually a woman.
Yeah, and I take your point that at the fringes there is craziness. I mean, I have a friend of a friend who is a self-proclaimed trans woman who has a beard and who has no intention of having any kind of reassignment surgery. And I don't think that it's reasonable for that person to claim that other people are bigoted if they don't want
I'm sorry,
quotation marks with a beard.
Dude, I'm sorry. Actually, I have to run because my dad has a surgery I have to go with him to right now.
Go for it, Ben.
We can finish this up another time also. I'm happy to do like a second part and we can connect them. So
yeah, that'd be great.
Okay,
excellent.
Cool.
Thanks.
Sounds good. Be well. Bye-bye.
Take care. Cheers. Bye. Ben, thanks for jumping back on the phone with us. I know that you're a busy guy, but I wanted to give you the opportunity for us to wrap up this conversation, especially about trans, without you being misunderstood in any way, and to flesh out your thoughts properly. So, as I recall it, and for people who are listening to this, in the interim between when you last heard Ben speak and now, I have had 2 twins. So,
the world has radically changed in the interim.
My
break, then I'll be getting married.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, it'll all be over. I will have died. It'll be my son who's doing this podcast. So my ability to recall precisely what we were talking about may be somewhat impaired. But as I understand it, I was granting you a couple of things about on transgenderism. One is that feminism and transgender studies are somewhat inconsistent, right? That feminism claims that differences between men and women are largely due to sexism, and that the reason why girls play with dolls and boys play with fire trucks is just because of the patriarchy, because of structural reasons. Nothing innate. But then transgenderism says, well, I feel like a woman, and so I'm drawn to dresses and girly things and so on, as if that was actually something that is fundamental. But when you look at gender expressions across different cultures, across different times, they get expressed in very different ways. So yes, there is, and I will also grant you that at the edges of trans ideology, like the edges of, frankly, all ideologies, it falls apart into incoherence. So you made the point, one thing I do recall about our last conversation was that some people claim that if you don't want to have sex with a trans woman who has a dick, that makes you transphobic. That, I think we can all agree is just...
That's a conflation of gender and sex that I think is inappropriate, and I think this is one of the problems with the entire discussion, is that everyone is making category errors. And this is basically my argument, is that when I say that a transgender person is a man who thinks he's a woman, that's not an insult. That's a suggestion that it is a man who believes that he is a biological woman, not that he represents the more feminine characteristics. There are effeminate men. There are men who are so effeminate that they believe that they're women. But the idea of the trans civil rights movement is that we are supposed to treat a trans man who has a surgery exactly as though he were a biological woman, which seems to me asinine.
So, I mean, I think that part of the problem here is that you're actually giving credence to the wrong version of trans people's of the trans claim. That when you
Well,
say
if you make a different claim, I'm happy to. That's the one that I hear most commonly. So if you're willing to
So,
give me one that seems
yeah.
less crazy, then I'm happy to.
Well, here's-
I'm happy to see whether I agree with it or
Well,
not.
here's the one that I think that a psychologist or a sociologist would give you, which is that there is this phenomenon that has been consistently observed in which someone persistently over time expresses the belief that they regard as being unavoidable, that their gender is different from what their sex organs suggest. And so they're not claiming the woman who claims to be a man is not claiming that she is exactly like a man. Obviously she isn't, because otherwise she wouldn't need gender reassignment surgery and hormone replacement therapy. What she's saying is that there's an incoherence between gender and sex. And if psychologists, after rigorous analysis, concur that that individual is unlikely to live a fulfilled and coherent life if they're forced to suppress that different gender, then I don't see what is gained by insisting that that gender is illusory any more than any of our genders are illusory, because we all know guys who are very effeminate and women who are very butch. So if there are people who persistently over time fall into this category of people who feel like their gender mismatches their sex, I think you're kind of attacking a straw man to then say, but it's not their sex. Well, they know it's not their sex. That's why they have to undergo the surgery.
Well, but that's not the insistence. The insistence is that I use a pronoun. Pronoun describes sex, not gender. Okay,
Well,
this attempt to conflate sex and gender is foolish. If your argument is that I have to acknowledge that the person has gender non-conforming characteristics, then I am happy to do that. That again, I have no problem with that. If you want to have a surgery, that's fine with me. But if you're going to insist that I address you by a pronoun that is based on biology, because you have a gender that differs from your biology, then the answer is no, because this pronoun was designed for biology. It wasn't designed for your self-identification based on gender.
Well, it wasn't entirely. I mean, the problem is that we've only got one word. That he and she refer to two things in modern civilization.
It has never referred to any. He and she have never historically referred to anything except for biological males and biological females, and to suggest otherwise is historically ignorant.
That's because we've never had trans people before. This hasn't been a
that's not true. That's not true at all. As trans activists would be the first to tell you, there have been trans people, men living as women for centuries. I mean, that's nothing new.
Sorry,
what is new is the insistence that my wife, who is a biological woman, should be called she in the same way that Caitlyn Jenner should be called she. It's silly. It's
I wasn't saying that there have been no transgender people in the past. What I'm saying is that there has been no widespread phenomenon of this as an issue that has to be dealt with by the English language. To the extent that there were transgender people...
Because by the way, I agree with that. I don't think this is an issue that has to be dealt with by the English language. I think that we have many other words that describe transgender people, including the word transgender.
Yeah, I mean, if you could invent a new he or she, which maps onto gender instead of to biological sex, would that be okay?
Yes.
And apply it to everybody?
Well, I mean, I think it would be kind of hard to apply it to 6 billion people. I think it would be distinctions that would become very confusing very quickly. The idea of having, like, every individual could have their own gender.
No.
Fast, right?
No, I'm just saying that the 98...
here's the problem. I think that you get very quickly. I think the whole thing deconstructs insanely fast. If the idea is that now we're saying there are two genders, I don't think you agree with that, or the trans community agrees with that. I think they believe that there are more than two genders, correct?
No, I think that they think that there are... Well, I think that there are two, but there's some fuzziness in the middle along the spectrum in the same way that there is with sexuality. I
think that's it. And I think that now I think there's an attempt to tie gender back into sex, which gets you back to the biological question instead of back to the gender.
I'm not trying to tie it back into sex, because there are biological people who are intersex. There are people who are biologically neither male nor female. But I think the gender studies claim that is the most plausible and the most difficult to knock down for me is a kind of analog to the sexuality claim, which is that there are heterosexuals and there are homosexuals, but a large minority of people, or perhaps even a majority, lie somewhere along a kind of a fluid spectrum, and we just sort of have to lump them into one end of the category or the other. I know that is controversial to some people, but I don't think it's necessarily
controversial to me.
Controversial to you.
I generally agree with that. But I'm not sure what that has to do with again, the conflation of sex and gender. Like we understand that one of the ways that we identify, to use the analog, one of the ways that we identify, there are two ways that we have to look at sexuality itself, sexual orientation itself. One is with regard to desire, and one is with regard to behavior. And these are very stark distinctions, particularly in the religious community, because if you have a man who's attracted to other men but never acts on it, is this person homosexual? So by desire, the person's homosexual. By behavior, the person is asexual. Right? So I think that specificity in language is required, and I think the fuzziness in the pop culture around this stuff is really damaging. I think it's damaging to if the trans movement is making the case that you're making, then I kind of agree with the case that you're making insofar as there are people who identify with different aspects of femininity or masculinity at different levels. What I disagree with is that there is one level that is man or woman.
Yeah,
like
so
if that's the case, because I think that's actually too simplistic. I think the idea that a man is a guy who picks up heavy shit, and a woman is a woman is a person who likes arranging flowers is actually somewhat. There may be some root truth to it, but I don't think that it's hard and fast by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I mean, it's also condescending, and it backtracks on a half century of feminist advances.
Agreed.
What if we found some kind of? I'm trying to grope towards some kind of intellectual coherence and compromise here. What if along the spectrum, right? And by the way, just so that's very clear to any listeners, I was not calling the spectrum of sexuality the same thing as the spectrum of sex. I was saying
you're pretty clear about it being an analog.
Yeah, it's an analog, right? So there's a spectrum of biological sex. There's a spectrum of gender characteristics, and there's a spectrum of sexuality, and there are probably lots of other spectrums as well. But let's suppose that on this gender spectrum, where there are some people who are somewhat more masculine in their characteristics and interests, and other people who are somewhat more feminine in their characteristics and interests, there comes a point at which a person is so far on the edge of one, which contradicts their biological sex, that they feel internally incapable of living a fulfilling life, unless they fully inhabit those opposite characteristics. In the same way that a gay person who is maybe only 10% gayer than another person who is capable of passing as a straight person and living a life as a straight person, even though they're somewhat bisexual and kind of attracted to the same sex. If you push the dial just up to 11, you get a person who is not going to be able to live a fulfilled life unless they're out as a gay person. Couldn't you imagine, and I'm just thinking aloud here because this isn't an analogy I've made before, but what is wrong with the analogy of saying if a person feels so far along the gender spectrum that in the opposite direction of their biological sex, then why don't we just grant them that they are that thing? And if you want to, I suppose if you want to create a third category that is gender pronouns instead of just biological sex pronouns, you can, but to me that overcomplicates things.
To me, it's absolutely necessary, because the fact is that a biological man who believes that he's more comfortable as a woman is not a biological woman, and conflating the two things is a problem. We don't call a gay man is describing his behavior or desires, right? He's still a man. But that's because there's no contradiction between being a male and being gay, right?
No, of course.
There is a contradiction between being a biological male and being a woman.
Yeah,
so the attempt to override that contradiction is completely asinine. I think that if you're going to come up with a third group of nouns that you want to use, or pronouns that you want to use, then I'm perfectly willing to grant it to you, right? I'm perfectly willing to say that people are transgender. I'm perfectly willing to say that people are that people are intersex. We had this part of the discussion earlier. What I see in society is not that, and I think that you are actually making a more sophisticated case than the transgender civil rights movement makes, which is that it is my burden as a citizen to treat you as though you are a woman when you are not a biological woman. To the extent that in many hospitals, for example, like this is not a minor thing. I mean, I know doctors. My wife is one. In hospitals, you are able now to write down the biological sex of your child as opposite to the biological sex of your child, which doesn't do the doctor any good. The doctor walks in thinking the stomach cramp is a period, and it turns out the kid's biologically male. You end up in utter absurdity.
You do end up in utter absurdity, which is why I said at the beginning that at the fringe of this ideology, like at the fringe of so many ideologies,
but I don't think this is the fringe. I think the case you're making is actually more fringe than the case they're making in terms of the numbers of people who believe it. Right? There are people who actually say that Laverne Cox is as much of a woman as my wife. Laverne Cox is not as much of a woman as my wife if we are speaking in any biological terms. And we obviously are speaking in biological terms because those are the only terms that people are discussing. If we were talking about Laverne Cox as a biological man who believes that he is a female and has attributes that are more typically feminine, I agree with all of the things that I just said. I think it's a much more accurate depiction of reality than just calling Laverne Cox she.
So, I mean, I think part of what it sounds to me like has got your goat here, if I can use an old good old 1920s phrase, is the sloppiness and the intellectual clumsiness with which the left has pulled off this revolution, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I think that it's not just sloppiness, and I think it's purposeful. I think I think there are a lot of people on the left who know what I'm saying is true and refuse to acknowledge it for purposes of political division, when we all can agree that there are people who have conditions that lead them to be more effeminate than the average male, for example, and that is an attribute. I'm not arguing that people don't have attributes. I'm arguing that you can't call that attribute. You can't now say that the person's female when they're biologically male. I failed. Honest to God, I do not understand why anything that I'm saying is even mildly controversial right now.
Well, the reason why it's controversial is because you're taking the easiest cases for your end of this, the easiest examples for your perspective, like a child who's in a hospital who has a sex on their medical chart that is completely unhelpful and, in fact, deleterious to that child's health because it points doctors in the wrong direction. I mean, I think any.
Okay, so give me a different context. Give me a different context where this is a controversial proposition.
Well, the case of a friend of mine whose child is 8 years old, who has always identified just since day one, exhibits case study, perfect example of what psychologists call transgenderism. He has always wanted to be a girl. He has just constantly pushed back against the characterization of him as a boy, and they're caught in a real kind of cultural pickle about exactly what to do about that. I know that this then bumps up against a whole bunch of extraneous questions, which you and I would probably agree on, about whether or not the state should be involved in deciding this, whether or not school boards should be involved in deciding this, whether or not health services should be coercing parents into making one decision or the other. But there is this phenomenon which is not as easy as you're portraying it, that sociologists and psychologists are now well aware of, and that the science is now, large.
How am I portraying it that's not easy? I mean, I'm not saying this child doesn't have a condition. The condition is well established. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the child doesn't have an issue that's going to make it harder for this kid harder for this kid to live a happy life. That's obvious.
Well, but your prescription.
The suggestion is that my prescription is
makes it harder still.
Sorry, go ahead.
Your prescription makes it harder still for those people, right? So your prescription solves the problem of the child in the doctor's hospital who has a misaligned sex on their chart, but it doubles down on a situation in which there is enormous.
So you're assuming there are a couple of things that you're assuming. You're assuming there are no countervailing effects to simply labeling sex arbitrarily self-appointed. That there are no countervailing effects. That there are no costs and benefits to this. That it's just an easy call, right? You just say,
no.
Okay, well, the kid's a girl. Okay, well, when an entire society says that a biological boy is a girl, that's going to have some impact in terms of the malleability of children.
When have I said there are no costs?
I'm sorry?
I've never said there are no costs.
Right. Well, so let's be honest about the cost, because the idea seems to be that that seems to be the idea promulgated. What does it cost you to just use the pronoun that the kid wants to use? Beyond that, I think that you actually have to examine in a realistic way whether it is biologically and scientifically well established enough that hormone suppressants and biological surgery are a solution that is effective enough to be applied to children, particularly when we're talking about an 8-year-old. I mean, the vast majority of children who express some level of gender dysphoria when they're very young grow out of it.
Yeah, I mean,
this kid hasn't even hit puberty yet.
That's why I flagged this example as being a difficult one, as being the most difficult one. But I mean,
what's not difficult for me is to suggest that it is not my duty in society to say that this kid is a girl. This kid is not a girl. This kid is a biological boy. And the reason that I say that is because there are lots of other people listening.
Yeah,
I wouldn't go up to. I mean, if you're asking me if I would go up to the kid and say you're a boy, right? Like just a random kid and say you're a boy. No, I don't see the duty in doing that. But if the question is on a public policy one, which is what you and I are discussing, we're public figures, right? Then the answer is no. Society does not have a duty to characterize this child as a boy, to characterize this child as a girl when she's a biological boy.
My sense is that what you're actually objecting to are a couple of things. That it's not actually the science. That it's one, coercion, because you're a libertarian and you don't like the idea of imposing our beliefs on children and the state or other institutions imposing their beliefs on individuals. And two, your general, what is usually admirable, antipathy towards faddism, towards like hopping on bandwagons and kind of virtue signaling and culture warrioring. Am I right that this is sort of part.
I mean,
of that.
those are. I think those are both relevant facts, but I think that I'm also very much concerned with you know with the costs of the policies that we're talking about. I do think it has a major impact when an entire society starts to pretend that sex is reducible to whatever someone believes.
I think that it will. I think that you're right that it will have an impact. I think that at the fringes, that impact will be ridiculous, such as the case of the misaligned sex on the child's medical chart. But that those instances can be mitigated and erased and kind of brought into common sense by people of goodwill on both sides.
So here's where I did.
Let me just quickly finish the thought. But that on the balance of upsides and downsides, that the downside of having this small minority of human beings who have this condition in a very consistent and persistent and unavoidable way, the downside of having them be so suicidal and so bullied and so misunderstood is a worse downside than the downside of us all having to kind of get our heads around a slightly different understanding.
So there are a few assumptions. So there are a few assumptions that I actually have some basic disagreements with you on. So assumption number one is that the reason transgender people have a high suicidality rate has to do with societal non-acceptance. I disagree with this on a general level. I'm not saying that it doesn't exacerbate the suicide rate, but I would suggest that the research tends to show that the suicide rate in among transgender people, even in incredibly accepting areas, is sky high, and that the mitigation of that is not due.
It's a lot less.
There's very split research on that. That it dramatically lowers the rates of suicide. In fact, we actually the research on suicide generally is incredibly variable on what causes suicide. The link between bullying and suicide is not clear by any stretch of the imagination, as even the National Institute of Health recognizes.
We were making the analogy before to sexuality, even though they're discrete things, and I don't want them to be confused. And in the 1960s, it would have been possible to say the same thing about gay people. In fact, throughout a lot of the 20th century, it would have been. And the best we can say about the relationship between trans people, whether the normalization of trans people will lead to higher rates of trans suicide or not, is that we don't know, because there aren't a lot of societies where trans people have full acceptance. Most
that's true. But if you want to use gays and lesbians as an analog, if you want to use gays and if you do want to use gays and lesbians as an analog, society is far more accepting of gays and lesbians than it ever has been in human history, and the rate of gay and lesbian suicide is still 4 times higher than the national average. So
it's a lot less than it was.
And
it's a lot higher in conservative societies than it is in liberal ones.
It's incredibly high still in places like San Francisco. So the question is, are you going to, what is the margin?
Yeah,
so let's assume there's a margin. Let's assume you're right.
I'm
not saying there's no difference, but let's assume that there is a difference. So that's a statistic on one side. Now here's a statistic on the other side. What percentage of children who otherwise would not have been concerned about their gender are now concerned about their gender because they're hearing about it in public school every day, or because the media is pushing this line? And the evidence on this side is that the rate of reported gender dysphoria has skyrocketed in recent years, along with the quote unquote public awareness. The same thing has happened with regard to sexual orientation. So the argument would be, if you're going to use these as analogies, the argument, I guess, on the countervailing side would be that all these people were there, they were just hidden. But I don't see the tremendous evidence for that, particularly like to take sexual orientation as the analog. If you look at the levels of people who identify as heterosexual among older people in Britain, it's like over 90% of people who are over the age of 60 in Britain identify as exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual. And if you look at people who are aged 18 to 24 who identify as exclusively heterosexual or homosexual, the number is something like 50%. Yes. So is that genetic? Are we saying that 50% of people were closeted?
No.
Or are we saying that there's a cultural there is a cultural impact on sexual behavior and gender orientation? I think to ignore environmental impacts on these things is pie in the sky wishful thinking. And I think that if you're talking about, like, to take a statistical case, let's say that, well, what is the transgenderism right now? I can't remember the latest.
I don't know.
It's very hard to gauge.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it's incredibly low. I mean, it's the number of transgenders in American society is, I think last estimate was something like 1.4 million out of 330 million.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that it's like 1 in 300 to make the math very simple. So let's say 1 out of every 3 kids suffers with transgenderism. Okay, this is just to take a statistical example. And now let's say that there's out of every 300 people, there are now 5 kids who start questioning their own gender because they're being told that gender is malleable and you can choose your own gender as you go along in life. Is that a net positive or a net negative? If we're just looking at the numbers, I would suggest that's a net negative. that reinforcement of male and female as separate biological sexes is a positive and useful thing, and that an entire society changing all of this on the basis of the one kid is actually a mistake. That's a utilitarian argument, right? So, again, I think it's a lot more complex than people are making it out to be.
Yeah, I completely take your point. So this comes down to something of a leap of faith about the extent to which the suicidality and depression of transgender people is caused by their confusion about their own gender, excuse me, and the extent to which it's caused by their sense that they're not accepted and that they're broken and that they are fundamentally unequal as human beings. The biggest
right on the utilitarian calculation. So there's two calculations I object to. One's the utilitarian calculation, where I don't think the evidence is entirely on the side of society ought to just say that sex is malleable or gender is malleable. And conflate the two. And then there's the basic truth argument, which is I just don't like terminology being used in a false way because I think that's a bad precedent and I don't like it generally. So don't tell me that a man is a woman when a man is not a woman. Say that he's a man who is transgender and has feminine attributes. Be specific with your language. I don't think that's too much to ask.
Or you can say he's a woman, his gender is female, and his sex is male.
Yes, that's fine. I mean, but then you have to define gender. You have to say that gender means a set of behavioral attributes.
Yes, and on the utilitarian question, just so we don't leave that before we run out of time again, I would say that I agree with you, by the way, that the whole born this way vibe is kind of bullshit. I mean, as someone who is now married to a guy, I actually could have gone the other way. It's conceivable. I completely agree that by opening up homosexuality,
yeah, I mean, it's not just you, by the way. The statistics tend to show that the vast majority of women who are lesbian have had sex with a man at some time in the past, and on average, actually had sex with more men than the average heterosexual woman. The same thing is true with gay men. Most gay men have had sex with women at some point.
In a strange way, I kind of side more with conservative Christians than I do with my gay fellow travelers, in the sense that I do think that if you make it totally okay to fool around with, for dudes to fool around with other dudes, more dudes will fool around with other dudes. I think if you think that's a downside in society, then we can have that conversation. But I think that it's actually, on the whole, a better thing, because dudes who want to fool around with other dudes get to fool around with other dudes. Now, if we transpose
right, and
that,
at least you're making an honest argument now. So I agree with you on the argument, and I think then we can have an argument about individual human happiness and societal happiness and sexual confusion. But I think that one of the things that drives me utterly insane about these debates, whether it's same-sex activity or whether it is transgenderism, is this lockstep willingness to flip science on its head or ignore the relevant social science data in order to achieve a certain purpose. So
I'm with you on that.
The born this way argument is I listen. I agree with you on virtually everything that you just said with regard to the born this way argument. I don't find that particularly relevant, and it annoys me when people say things like born this way with regard to sexual orientation, but gender can be chosen, right? These things do not conflate. They do not work along the same lines. Like, sexual orientation is completely set and unchangeable, but your gender can change over time, and it's not biologically set, or maybe it is biologically set, but the whole thing is just.
Yeah, I think the most,
and then we can figure this out. It's like these arguments seem to be picked at random from a tree of usefulness.
Yeah, I think the most reasonable approach is to say that it's all fluid, and either you should come down on one side or the other and believe that we're all born this way and it's fixed, or accept that it's malleable and try to figure out how. So let me just wrap with this. Do you think that? And this is not a gotcha question, but just a question about who you think is going to win the culture wars over the next generation. Do you think that in 50 years' time you'll be regarded as a bigot for holding these views?
I think that there's always the possibility that we'll all be regarded as bigots for whatever views we hold in 50 years' time. I can't. But really
this one's a doozy. This is one where I think
this one is a doozy. Let's put it this way: if I am, then I think that will be. I think not. And the reason I think not is because I think that we in sophisticated Western cultures tend to think that we're the center of the world, and there's an entire other world out there where people don't buy into the faddish redefinitions of fundamental terms of the day. Like, I think that I think this is true on a lot of social issues. I think that the idea that I think what we'll actually end up with is sort of the consensus position that you and I both end up with, which is we'll form a new set of nouns and pronouns to deal with this, but the complete conversion of he and she over into subjective self-assessment is I don't think that's going to work. So I think we'll actually end up with a more this seems to be how it goes, right? That people have ignorant ideas about what homosexuality is, and then there are better arguments for what it is and what drives it and the costs and benefits to individuals, and then we come up with some sort of consensus positions. But I don't think that this is. I don't think this is one of those cases where I'm going to be sitting around 50 years from now and people are going to be saying, well, you were wrong to say that biological man was a man. That biological man was definitely a woman. I think that one's going to be a hard sell.
All right. We'll agree to disagree about that final point. Ben Shapiro, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time again.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
You got it.